Thank you. And to moderate, or actually to lead the conversation for our next must-do panel, please welcome the Chairman and Advisory Council Chair of Force for Good, Ketan Patel, and his conversationalists.
Thank you very much for this wonderful platform to discuss these very important issues. I think the last session actually set the context for this one. And this one is focused on the just transition. And I'd like to highlight it in the following way in terms of what this is. And what this will be is really a dialogue between the three of us to speak about the just transition. Is that better? Is that? Okay, got it. Right up here. Okay. Force for Good looks at the system of capitalism itself to see, can it transition and fund a just transition? Can it deliver the SDGs? And we all know, because we read it so regularly, that the UN is asking the financial institutions that have something like $400 trillion to take a small percentage of that to fund the SDGs. And the estimate was, out of the $400 trillion, it needs approximately $30 trillion to 2030 to fund the SDGs. Now, we took those estimates and we analyzed them to see whether the number really was 30. If you include the rich countries, who also have large pockets of poor people, underprivileged within their midst, and you add inflation, and you add the cost of the war and COVID, and how far we've gone back on the SDGs, and the fact that only 12 to 15% of the SDGs have been achieved, then that number actually grows to more like $135 trillion out of 400. What that tells you is that there is no way the SDGs will get funded. And I'd like to pause there a second, because if you let that sink in, no one will dedicate $135 trillion out of $400 trillion to fund anything, because that money is just not available. It's already in savings accounts, in pensions, insurance policies, paying wages, building roads, and so on and so on. So what do we do to actually get the SDGs achieved? And what does a just transition mean, and who is it for? Capitalism itself has served something like a third of the world's population. So this great system that has created the largest amount of wealth ever in human history serves about a third of the world. 2/3 of the world are not really participants in the financial system, in the global payment system, don't have formal education systems anywhere near what the 1/3 has, do not mainly have formal jobs too. And I do hear statistics like something like 90% or more of people in Africa and many countries in Asia are entrepreneurs. And I think that hides something. Are they entrepreneuring, or are they just living subsistence because it's an unformalized system? And I think if we step back and we're very honest, we'd say they're not really entrepreneuring. They have no choice because they cannot be formally employed today, because there is not enough industry there. So this just transition has to transition the consuming world, the 1/3, and the rest, the 2/3. And I think a very important question was posed earlier, which is, what does that transition model look like? What is the model of change that we believe in? I think it was Dan Esty that posed it. So I'm going to begin that by turning to my colleagues. You can see are the CVs up? No. Why don't you make a brief introduction, very brief, and go straight into this.
Hello.
What do you think the transition is about?
Sure. So I'm Rob Schuwerk. I'm the Executive Director of Carbon Tracker's North America office. Carbon Tracker is a non-for-profit financial think tank. Our primary purpose is to translate climate-related risks into financial risks so that the financial markets can respond to them. That's our goal. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, in terms of the SDGs and some of the goals and the must-haves for the global futures related to the wind down of fossil fuels and accountability. And in particular, risks related both to transition and to the physical impacts. So most of our work is based on transition risk, and that is translating these climate risks into risks that are posed primarily to fossil-intensive firms like oil and gas companies, to the extent that they are or are not transitioning. One of the least appreciated, but I think most important pieces that we've done in the last year was by one of our financial analysts, Maurizio Carulli, that focused on Shell, and it posed a simple question. It said, what is the expected discounted cash flows that are going to come from Shell continuing in the business model that's proposed, compared to a business model in which it ceased sanctioning new oil and gas projects, as the IEA has said we need to do to be able to meet the 1.5 degree target. And so we looked at this and we used the same weighted average cost of capital, the same price projections, commodity price projections going forward for comparability purposes. And what it showed was that, yes, the company might make about 17% more over the period from sanctioning in accordance more or less with what it is intending to do now. And we extrapolated out to 2050. They hadn't provided plans that long. But that's within the stock price dispersion over the last 10 years for the stock, which is about 21%, okay? So that sits within the volatility that we already see historically in this particular stock. And you could imagine that if the company is sanctioning projects, it may over-sanction, right? If we're successful in making the transition, at least with respect to some of the sectors that are going to be most impacted for a company like Shell, whether it's vehicles essentially. In that case, if you assume that they should have a higher weighted average cost of capital in the context of the energy, of sanctioning projects rather than one in which they haven't sanctioned anything new, the numbers change pretty substantially. An additional 50 basis points halves the advantage of sanctioning new projects. An additional 100 basis points eliminates it essentially completely. And the reason that we wanted to do this work is to really demonstrate that there is not that much to be gained by continuing to sanction. And for some investors, there may be value in that risk aversion and less volatility by not sanctioning some of these projects. So that's one way of thinking about it from an energy transition perspective. You could expect, for example, that in a world in which we are transitioning, we would see lower commodity prices going forward, which would be one risk that you'd want to manage. So even though we focus, I'm going to say one other thing. So even though we focus a lot on transition risk, we know that investors are not moving fast enough today. And that got us thinking about, well, what kind of understanding do they have of the physical climate risks? And these are also being translated. So investment consultants and others provide advice to pension funds on the impact of their on their portfolios from climate change. And what people don't know is that pretty much all of that information comes from a select set of economic models that have been around for about 30 years that have tried to calculate the damages that come from runaway climate change. And those are, in theory, coming from what climate scientists have said is going to happen. But when you look at the economic models and the climate science, you see radically different conclusions. So you'll see in some of these economic models of damage that in a 6 degree centigrade warming world, we end up with a 10% impact on GDP out to 2050 compared to what it would have otherwise been, okay? And in both scenarios, GDP is growing. Whereas when you look at information from climate scientists, a 5 degrees centigrade warming is considered an existential threat. Okay? These things are really incompatible. Why are they incompatible? Part of it is in the damage functions, people can only measure certain aspects. And so they take a backwards looking study of the impact of 1 degree or 2 degrees of warming, okay? And what impact that they think that might have had on certain activities, rather than taking a forward-looking view that the climate scientists do of potential tipping points where we move from one equilibrium to another. And we can't easily reverse that. The damage functions don't contain some of the most significant impacts. So for example, changes in precipitation patterns, some climate models suggest could reduce wheat production, arable land for wheat production by about 75%, or the slowing down of the AMOC circulation current, which could drastically change temperatures in Europe and other places. They don't take these into account because it's difficult in some cases to model. And they don't take into account the possibility of political instability and other things that might ensue from climate chaos. The result of that is that you see pension funds getting a message that really, in some ways, if you look at the data, you'd say, what is the urgency here? Why do I need to move my portfolio if the damages are relatively small? And that's something we really need to correct.
Susan, I'm going to pose the question to you somewhat differently. We thought we were making progress through COP26, and then we've had ESG being enormously pushed back by a group of stakeholders in the US. How do you see the stakeholder view of this transition? Do they fear that there will be no just transition for their membership? What is the reason for this pushback?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and it's great to be here with everybody. I'm with the International Youth Foundation, so it's no surprise that I think one of the key stakeholders are young people. And I know we talked about in the earlier panel, Greta and so many other activists, and yes, they may be young, but they are not only the largest youth population that we've ever had on this planet, they are incredibly active. And so while there are setbacks, I think the way we look at it at IYF, and just very quickly, IYF has worked around the globe for more than 30 years, and our mission is to equip and inspire young people and connect them to opportunities. And we are not going to have an energy transition without young people, right? Because they are the workforce. And so we have to overhaul our whole training and education systems so that young people who are already clamoring and are on the front lines, that they're equipped in order to really lead in this transition. So when we think about, the stakeholders and where we go from here, one of the really foundational aspects of IYF has always been about public-private partnerships. We are not going to get where we need to go, particularly with the green energy transition, without understanding industry and obviously industry making changes, and young people who are equipped to help industry make changes. And that skills mismatch, that is really an issue we have to tackle as not only a country here in the US, but globally. And I just wanted to put a plug out for a paper that we recently co-wrote with the Federation of American Scientists, so please Google, Building the Talent Pipeline for the Energy Transition, because that puts out there some ideas to really get it to what you're talking about, Ketan. I'll pass it back to you because I know you have lots of questions for us. So.
Okay. I'm going to ask the second part of the questions on this transition. So if the money is not going to be made available, but the case is really clear that it needs to change, what will change such that we close this gap? We did a very detailed piece of work looking at the metrics, the indicators, 150 indicators underneath the 17 SDGs. And what you find is that actually you find yourself coming away very optimistic, because you realize that a third of the SDGs require policy change. Not cash, but policy change. And that's profound. If we just swallow that first, it means someone has to have the guts to do what the EU thinks it's doing with its Green Deal, what the US might be doing with the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's potentially a third of the SDGs. Another third is linked to the public sector spend and governments building things, roads and infrastructure and schools and so on. Unfortunately, that is very poorly funded, and it's unlikely governments get to make the case that sees large amounts of money go into that. And the remaining third is all private sector. It's technology, it's the finance industry, it's industrials, changing the way they actually do business so that we can transition. So this transition is very possible. If you look at the initiatives required, our recent report launched on Monday points to 15 large initiatives that could, if scaled, they could solve 70% of the SDG gap. So there is cause to be enormously optimistic, but yet it's proven to be enormously difficult. And we've managed to have an industrial revolution and conquer the whole world just about, and then see people freeing themselves by collaborating with each other and peacefully or unpeacefully exiting the colonials. And we put a man on the moon, but we don't seem to be able to solve the SDGs. Why? What is that transition? Why is it so difficult?
I think the simple answer is people don't want to make any radical changes unless they absolutely have to. So it's kind of the principle that things have to get worse before they get better. And I hate to see hope in all of the physical impacts that we've seen that are obviously between the floods and the fires over the last year, but I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. You know, I see hope in other things too, and so we do look at financial metrics, and Goldman Sachs, actually you used to be at Goldman Sachs, yeah? It did a report on the internal rates of return over the last 10 years that oil and gas companies were expecting from their projects. And so, you know, quite simply, internal rate of return, that is what they expect to get from the project, and they'll have hurdle rates where they need to have some percentage, you know, 10, 15, 20%, that they expect, otherwise they're not going to sanction that project. And the point was that over the last 10 years, they've moved that up in mass pretty much, or on average, I guess, from about 10% up to almost 20%. Now that's not enough to get us where we need to go on climate, but that is showing, you know, that they're blinking a bit, right? They know that that these are probably riskier than they had previously anticipated. Now, this paper argued that those need to come back down to meet the world's energy needs. I disagree with that part, but I think it's good, and you see signs like that. You see S-curve deployment of electric vehicles in places like United Kingdom. So you're seeing the beginnings of the snowball rolling downhill, and hopefully we can keep that going.
Yeah, I think
Susan.
that's exactly right. We are really seeing some changes when it comes to the incentives and getting back to the role of the private sector. When they see that there is going to be a return on investment, and when their employees, who are primarily young people who are skilled, are demanding that, whether they work at FedEx, and I'll tell a story in a minute about that, or Caterpillar, or Microsoft, all the companies who we partner with, that is driving the change. And so, for example, for FedEx, who works a lot with disadvantaged youth, actually, in Mexico in particular, and Mexico is the only country that's producing electric vehicles, and coming to us and saying, okay, what are the skills then that we need to really move our whole logistics industry into a more energy efficient, because it saves money. I mean, for them, it's all about saving money. So they can reduce their costs by 20% if they move to a more energy efficient logistics distribution center. And with that, what do they need? They need employees. They need skilled employees who understand, and it's not higher level math, which we often think about with AI. It's really about data science, data management. It's the life skills to be able to think quickly, collaborate, work as a team, communicate clearly. These are absolutely essential for the energy transition. And I think when we look at what's happening right now, in all the meetings I've been in this week, I've been really shocked, having come to UNGA meetings for several decades. I've never seen such a focus on not just energy and the green transition, but AI. And the two disruptions have enormous opportunities. Again, getting back to young people who I've spent a lot of time with, who don't look at this as something weird and extraordinary. It's just part of their daily lives. So they use AI to gain the skills, and again, using life skills that are necessary to adapt, so that they can, most importantly, not only pull their families and look towards a future in the middle class, which is what most of them tell me, but also thinking about, how can I entered into this company, I was just going to do my job, then I'm thinking about, how can I make it more energy efficient? This is how they think, right? And so we really have to grasp into that energy, think about our training and education models and how we're very much going to make them more inclusive and overhaul them for an incredible opportunity we have right now. And I believe you that with the SDGs, we can get there. We absolutely can get there. But we have to embrace some new ways of thinking, and obviously young people are at the forefront.
That's very interesting, and I'm going to pick that up and ask the next part of the question, which is, do we really think we've mobilized We've all talked about it. We've done lots of things. We've set up lots of committees. There are new standards being introduced, but have we really mobilized? So to put a man on the moon, apparently in today's money, it's about $200 billion US in terms of what that project cost. It was one country and another country. One country mobilizing its people, its technologies to put a man on the moon. And that was tough, and we managed it. This is 193 countries with no one in charge who can actually say you must do A, B, or C. And we've got to mobilize solutions across the whole planet and be willing to share them. And the money, which nobody owns, in the first case of the space mission, there was a government that could say, I'm going to write this check because it matters to me. Now there's nobody who can say, I'm going to write this check. So this is a voluntary scheme to save the planet. Do you think we've mobilized?
So in my prior life, I used to work at the United States Agency for International Development for 26 years. And you talked about government and the role that government played in order to really mobilize capital and have that vision and drive energy. And one of my colleagues here, Lana Stoll, who is here, can relate to this. And as Dan was talking about, like, you look back on all the mistakes you made 30 plus years ago. I would say the challenge we have now is fragmentation. And so that paper I talked about, Building the Talent Pipeline, is all about how we have the capital, we have the resources, exactly what you said. We have to actually really build the bridges between the different stovepipes and fragmentation that have just erupted over the years, that I can say 30 plus years ago did not exist as much as they do today. And that's, I think, one of our biggest challenges.
Susan, I'm going to turn to Robert. Robert, AI, it demonstrates to us the opportunity to leapfrog the last generation. As we looked at our 15 initiatives that we think can close 70% of the gap, they come from all corners of the world. One of them was from India. It introduced a series of technologies that gave you financial inclusion and a peer-to-peer payment system. And as a result, people who are some of the poorest ended up with bank accounts, 500 million of them, in a space of 8 years. Now here we have another generation of technology. I know there's an expert in the audience, Jerome Glenn, who understands the opportunity and the threat really well. What is the opportunity that you see of a physical transition on using everything we have available as technology to make this shift?
Maybe we should get Jerome up here on this as the actual expert on AI. So we don't do a lot on AI, but that's right. but I will say that we have not even deployed some of the physical solutions that we could deploy, and scale today. Part of what we do is also look at energy systems around the globe and grids. And one of the challenges that we've taken on for ourselves is how do you decarbonize a grid like Kazakhstan? In some ways, in Europe, you have multiple nodes. You have the ability to build renewables, at least where you can site them in many places, and connectivity isn't as much of an issue. But if you're in Kazakhstan, that's going to be quite difficult. And so we have to come up with solutions that are site-specific, that we can effectively have a one-for-one, where the replacement has attributes that are appropriate to it. We haven't worked on AI, but I think that getting to complex formulations on how you deal with transmission and distribution in a grid is going to be a great spot for that.
If I stick to the point of mobilization a little bit more, so I was reading quite a lot for the research we had to do, and we started to scour just what's available in the public on mobilization. And Brookings, which is a famous, of course, American think tank, middle of the road in some ways, conservative, it seems, had an article in there which said, we will not mobilize without friction. And what we need is people to refuse. We need the equivalent of non-cooperation. But that's the level of conscious awareness that needs to be in the public. Yes. That's how far we have to raise the anxiety level, such that they refuse to cooperate until change happens. Is that the way?
Yes, I think, and it's interesting, I did see that study by Brookings because we work quite extensively with them at IYF, and one of the things that we're seeing is not only the refusal of younger generations, and just a story I'll tell of this student who came from a really disadvantaged part, in this case in Brazil, and went to a vocational education sector. Or training. And again, this gets to, we have to focus on disadvantaged youth who are not in the higher level education system, and just wanting to be able to, earn a living, and then realizing, no, I have to be part of this transition. And so I think it's a mindset, and it's really a growth mindset that we see a lot of young people have who will refuse. Because to them, and we have to not go down the spiral of we'll never get there, right? I mean, the news, many of the young people we hear, it's a growth mindset of we're not there yet. What can we do to ultimately change that? And so looking at the innovations, a point you made earlier I thought was very important about entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is really survival in so many countries. It is, there is no such thing as unemployment, right, in many countries, in many sectors of society, because they have to do something in order to survive. So how can we, again, and technology, and we're doing a lot on actually how to use AI to reach young people who would never have access to understanding what are the skills they need actually to be part of the green energy transition. If we don't have this be an inclusive transition where people who do not have formal education can't see that they, and I'm going to tell another story from just, and
Please,
hear it, but this was yesterday. We were having a discussion at Microsoft, and it was on AI, and they beamed in David Garcia, who was a Venezuelan refugee, and he obviously had fled Venezuela for Spain, and he talked about how, he really, he just thought his life was over. How am I going to be a refugee in a country I don't have any, access to really higher level education? And there's so much that's available, obviously free, and he was able to get into one of the programs we work on with Microsoft in order to understand what are the skills he needs in order to be part of this revolution, and it's within the green energy sector. And he talked about, he was the one who really spoke to me. He said, I don't have higher level math skills. I never had math. I thought, oh, good, that's my background. And he said, but I had to adapt, I had to be collaborative, I had to be, really exercise my agency. And so I use that as an example because we talked about the must-haves in this conference. One of the must-haves we really believe is it has to be inclusive, and it has to be involve workforce development and overhauling the way we approach it and thinking about the most underserved young people in the globe.
Susan, that's very powerful. For our reports, we have a real forward, which is an interview of somebody who is in desperate need. So we've interviewed somebody from an Indian slum, somebody from a South African slum, a Ukrainian refugee was the last one. And you realize that their needs are the same as ours. They need opportunity to actually succeed in life, and they don't have it. Turning to you, Robert, I'm going to ask you a question based on, at some point I had to read the IPCC report, the long version. It's like 2,500 pages, I think, right? And it's in very small writing, and there's a lot of it. But as you go through it, you see that actually there's a section where they highlight the impact of different levels of CO2 emission, climate impacts on the world, and what it means. And a ruthless eye would say to me, if I looked at that map, it tells me the south of the world will burn. In the north, there'll be enough heat to have to transition industries. Farming, for example, will move from south to north, perhaps. If you haven't got arable land, it'll move across the continent. If you're in the EU, you have an opportunity to balance that up and still produce the food you wish to. So, but in the north, despite the climate change, you don't die in the numbers that they do in the south. And if you were callous, you'd look at it and say, I cannot help them, and they're going to die anyway. That is such an awful sentiment that comes out if you actually just clinically analyze the IPCC report. What it misses in some ways in the message is the interdependence between us all. So people won't just die there, they will migrate. And it only takes 2 million people to overthrow an Angela Merkel. No matter what her legacy is, that's what it takes, 2 million migrants. What do you see as the level of risk the North needs to really come to grips with?
So the risk that you're describing is, in a sense, if we head to that warmer world, so likely. But it's precisely the kind of risk that doesn't appear in anyone's, financialization of climate risk when they think about this from a physical standpoint. It absolutely has to get taken into account. And we are in a sort of climate political negative feedback loop right now. To the extent you see that, you can see the rise of jingoistic policies and politics that are happening that will only further fragment global cooperation. And although our organization works a lot on the private sector, we do need government intervention to deal with this. As you said, a third of the problem. So I think we've absolutely got to start by admitting that we are going to see that. We have the potential for social conflicts that flow from that. When you think about coral reef destruction, for example, hundreds of millions of people's incomes and livelihoods around the globe depend on those. We have to really internalize and assess what those costs are and be honest about that before we can begin to talk about the urgency. I think you said, I love your analogy, by the way, with the space program, putting somebody on the moon. We are nowhere near mobilized. We are nowhere near on a war footing in any sector to deal with this problem. You can see what Europe did in the wake of the Ukraine war. There was a glimmer of action and urgency, right? And they're burning far less coal today now than in any time.
Thank you both. I'm going to just draw it together just to say thanks very much to two people who passionately care clearly and have depth of knowledge on this issue. The positive message, I think, is that we can mobilize, but we haven't yet. Not to the degree of urgency that's required. We do have the benefits of technology innovation that can help us actually solve problems that were not solvable before. So we have that opportunity. But it requires us, probably all as individuals, to be part of that movement of change and to recognize consciously the consequences of our actions. And the solutions are definitely out there. That's what we saw in our depth of work, that the solutions are there. They need to be picked, championed, and scaled and rolled out globally. And that's an execution issue. It's not a vision issue, an innovation issue. It's an execution issue. Thank you very much. Thank you.